Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from the Western Cape Pod Bunker, located here in the heart of Cape Town, South Africa. This pod is presented to provide a platform and a voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It is dedicated to those individuals and community groups that are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. In today's Talking Transformation podcast, we're going to hear from three very different personalities. The four of us you're going to hear from have got at least three things in common. We're all town planners by trade. We've all worked together in the same metropolitan planning team. And each of us, at one point or another, have had to consider an alternative approach to the theory and the practical skills taught to us at school, in tertiary education and during the course of our careers. First up, Klaus Raber, a colleague who's been constantly challenging himself and his fellow professionals to take our skills and tools into the modern age. Klaus has consistently pushed the boundaries and consistently argued that the complexity of the work that we do requires a scientific approach and basis. He very much embodies a new wave built environment professional using an evidence-based approach to planning to think about policy and decision making. He now utilises those skills as a gun for hire in the private sector, working for the Palmer Development Group. Jaco Petzer has become one of the leading spatial data analysts in the country. He has put together a number of world-leading approaches to big data sets and directed a series of land use and spatial models to support decision-making and policy setting in the city of Cape Town. He's commandeered the largest servers known to man. He has run the numbers from valuations to zoning, from infrastructure capacities to movement patterns. He very much embodies the oracle in terms of knowing what's going on and understanding how we can use that information to inform our decision making. In the end, he'll tell you it's all about land use, people and buildings. But how we understand these three variables and their vast and complex nature, the formal, the informal, demographics, the typologies and so on, is where the magic starts to happen. Last but certainly not least, we speak to Eloise Rousseau. Eloise is currently based in Hong Kong in a very different living environment for the past year. We'll hear from her about the change in that lifestyle and urban environment, and ultimately in her expectations and skill sets. She's moved from the challenging urban environment and sweeping backdrop of Table Mountain here in Cape Town to the density and pace of Hong Kong. Eloise has taken it upon herself to add another dimension to her existing and practical experience by taking on a 4-month coding boot camp. Going from novice to graduate in that time, she talks about the opportunity and the reasons she chose to adapt her skill set. She's also written a really insightful blog on those experiences, and I'd really encourage you to read it. I'll be sure to share that piece with you in our Talking Transformation Twitter page. This episode is about trying to broaden the scope and the debate around what a contemporary built environment professional should be thinking about how we can inform our decision making, about what opportunities do exist. It isn't going to relegate the basics of being effective in terms of our communication or participation with civil society and often within a political space. This is about expanding the horizon and considering opportunities that some of us may not have even begun to think about. I hope you'll enjoy the episode and the perspectives kindly shared by these three top planners, top professionals at the top of their game. Enjoy the episode. So it's a Tuesday afternoon and I'm here in downtown CBD Cape Town and I'm with Klaus Raber. Klaus, welcome. Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast and thanks for making some time available to this afternoon.
Thanks, Pete. It's a great opportunity.
So, Klaus, you and I, we've known each other for about 5 years or more, and I was first aware of your work when we met up in Midrand at I think it was a spatial targeting workshop, if you remember quite well. And you were one of the first colleagues who I'd met who really challenged my perceptions and my understanding and the potential of using technology and in particular coding to support decision making in the built environment. At that stage, very much in a sort of planning environment. And you really pushed the boundary saying, it's not enough just to be a good map maker and use GIS and have an idea about databases. It's really something that needs to go far beyond that. So I'm really interested to get a sense of what first interested you in this angle and the approach of using different data science approaches to lead us down an evidence-based path?
Thanks, Pete. I think what's important from the get-go is to recognize in terms of my trajectory, my background is very much within the realm of humanities, of what some call the soft sciences. I wasn't even particularly good at maths in high school, so I'm not necessarily coming from a strong quantitative background. That's something that I've kind of developed over time. I think the question of coding and evidence-based planning, coding in itself is, from my perspective, and is merely a vehicle in order for us to almost rewire the way that we approach problems. Mm-hmm. It's not about the coding and the fact that nowadays coding is considered sexy in some circles, at least, or that it's exciting, all these things. In my mid-20s, I was doing an internship for the German Technical Development Agency, and my responsibility was trying to make sense of the efforts, not just by the South African Police Service, but by a whole raft of experts and academics, trying to answer the question, what does the government and civil society need to do to prevent violence? Mm-hmm. And after 6 months of workshops, it became very clear to me that there is no forward movement, and the reason for that is that all the various parties at these conferences, one conference after another, were preoccupied with the question of what are the structural causes of violence in our society in South Africa. And in doing so, they were approaching the problem purely from their own discrete theoretical background and their professional discipline, if you will. And because of that, and because of the time that they've invested in that theoretical framework and that prism through which to observe society, they were completely incapable of coming together and recognizing that actually it's not just about theoretizing, it's actually about action. There's a degree of urgency, not just with violence, but with the broader challenges facing our society, the social and economic pathologies, that absolutely requires a degree of urgency that some might call moving from formal to applied science. And this is really what my interest in evidence-based planning was about. It was about saying we can all write our PhDs on the causes of crime and the causes of urban inefficiencies and structural inequality, and that might engage us for many, many years. But we need to act immediately. We need to act within the short term. And to do so and to work together across disciplines, it is thus necessary to actually shift from trying to convince each other as to the underlying structural causes of what we're trying to address and move towards more proximate causes, looking, in other words, at patterns in society, patterns in space, patterns in our economy, and those patterns not in terms of our discrete lenses, but patterns as suggested by looking at data. And so for me, that was sort of a big light that went on in my mind to say, how do we bring all these different rafts of knowledge together in a, dare I say, value neutral kind of space so that we can actually act in the short term. Yeah, I would say that would be how I got into evidence-based planning.
And things like dealing with complexity in the same way. I mean, often very different opinions, very different starting points, and the ability to use sort of almost a neutral space to have some of those conversations. Maybe some thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think if one thinks about it in practical terms, and the wonderful thing about the planning profession is that there really isn't a facet of society that is outside of our scope, out of our mandate, in a sense. So if you think to yourself, if we identify, if the data suggests that there's a particular a location where there's a particularly high incidence of social violence, stabbing, etc., whatever the case may be. What has happened historically is that you would have one professor saying, well, the causes the underlying cause is structural inequality, so you address that incidence of that by addressing structural factors. The psychologist would say you have to look at the criminal trajectory and the criminal career. How did that person switch over into criminality 20 years ago? Mm-hmm. You have the third person that might have a different theory on what the underlying reasons are. But you can, through patterns, actually disrupt those concentrations and those clusters in space. And then in the long term, try to understand what those broader factors may be. And I think I'd leave it at that for now, actually.
No, 100%.
Yeah.
When you came into more of a sort of metropolitan planning environment, there were a number of sort of wicked challenges and problems that you were being asked to look at. How do you remember some of those challenges and the approaches that you had to consider in trying to apply some of the theory and that sort of evidence-based thinking in Germany back in the South African context and the challenges with a sort of metropolitan space here in Cape Town?
I think the first thing to be said is that it provided me this notion of shifting from a predominantly normative approach to planning, from that towards perhaps a more evidence-based approach to planning, is that it provided me with a framework to tackle some of these challenges that I was posed with. One being, how do we understand the space economy? How should we understand why are some business precincts failing while others are doing very well? What are the spatial factors that are driving those changes? And how can we then seek to understand the underlying causes for those patterns? And so the first task that I had, the most important work that I did, I believe, at the city, was exactly this question of how can we beneficiate the city's ever-expanding pool of administrative data that it generates and typically casts aside as part of its process? How do you actually beneficiate this untapped resource in furtherance of understanding the economy in space? Having adopted an evidence-based approach, it already started to answer some questions for me. Firstly, by approaching an evidence-based approach, what that effectively requires is that there needs to be consensus on exactly what particular words, terms, and objectives mean.
Understood, yeah.
How do you deconstruct something like, for example, spatial transformation? How do you deconstruct integration? These words, and it's not unique to South Africa, this is part of our legacy of having adopted a lot of continental European planning practices, this very normative approach to planning. So broad, undefined terms. The purpose of these terms are not necessarily to solve practical problems, but rather to make sure that everyone is in the same tent. So these terms are blank canvases upon which people with different interests and different aspirations can actually project their own aspirations onto this and understanding onto this board. The problem is when you're actually having to intervene in a complex system, it doesn't then help the different actors seeking to come together to solve the problem all have different understandings of what these words mean.
Yeah.
And by introducing an evidence-based approach, you are forcing people to actually explain exactly what they mean.
To break it down.
To break it down, and ideally break it down to as far as possible into measurable indicators. That, to me, I have found, especially with the work that I did at the city, that is some of the most powerful steps between identifying the problem, characterizing the problem, and then characterizing what is an alternative reality that we would like to achieve, or alternative state, because you have to define it in terms of measurable objectives.
Didn't you find it interesting that, you'd see a lot of institutions, blue chip companies looking at their own data sets I'm thinking of, for example, South African Property Owners Association releasing on a quarterly basis a whole raft of reports showing about office vacancies, and those become almost like the Bible for that particular time and period around a thought process or an understanding of a market, a sector of the economy. And yet the city or cities across the country have often been at odds in terms of putting out their own information. As you say, big data, information around land use information, building plans, where's it happening, what's it mean, how does it start to influence the private sector and help everybody, whether it be the public sector or private, with their decision making, and where are you going to spend that very important rand at the end of the day. Choices.
One of the things we recognized very early on, this project, by the way, that I'm referring to, this program is called ECAMP, which stands for Economic Areas Management Program. So we'll just refer to ECAMP from now on. But what we recognized fairly early on was that we have mentioned how this rich source pool of administrative data that gets almost generated in real time and expands in real time has been largely untapped. There's a strong lobbying happening countrywide about this metros pressuring national to release data, but I have not seen a willingness and, dare I say, the courage for municipalities to thoroughly beneficiate the data they do have access to, because in order to beneficiate data you need to agree on definitions, and to agree on definitions mean suddenly your catch-all terms that you were premising and justifying your interventions on become a lot more sticky.
Okay.
But what I wanted to mention was that this ECAMP process, we recognized that not only could it assist the city, when I say the city, I mean the plan is at the City of Cape Town to make better decisions and to actually test their own assumptions, but at least as important is the extent to which this data could be disseminated to business people, to NGOs, to civil society, because at the end of the day, the cost of information is a real cost, which is incorporated into the investment decision.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about if we want to unlock investment, if we want to stimulate job-rich investment, or whatever kind, it's essential that we look as a city, as local government, at every opportunity that there is available to us to actually reduce those costs. And there is nothing that is as infinitely, well, it's effectively a zero cost to make that data available. So it's not as if it requires a significant investment on the side of the city. It just requires a mindset change, that by making this data available, suddenly you are actually, not only are you lowering lowering effectively the risk of investment in the city, but you're also balancing the playing fields, because currently or historically it's only the real big guys that could afford to hire or conduct bespoke studies on, for example, a market assessment, where to build their next facility or their next depot, whereas the smaller operators had to then kind of follow where the big guys went. But if you make this data available across the board, you're actually leveling the playing field. And this was very much brought out in a 2008 OECD report, which actually said, it was a territorial review of Cape Town, of the functional region. And one of the top observations that this team made after a couple of months of looking at the city is recognizing that the city is so spread out that the normal market signals, and economies flourish based on how various actors and transactions happen in space,
and networks and so on.
And that signaling, that price clearing, and that signaling, and the networks, all of those things serve to what they call one of the agglomeration benefits. Actually has a positive feedback loop into the economic trajectory of the city. But if a city is too spread out, and our city is as everyone is aware, extremely low density, the economic nodes are very spread out, that actually imposes a cost on the functioning of the city and of the economy. I mean, let's use a case in point. And I would argue that cost thus results in suboptimal decision making on the side of the where the businesses choose to locate, because they will only have knowledge of particular parts of the city, and a lot of large sections of the city would be considered off the map.
Sure. Yeah.
So you start to have an increasing concentration of economic activity in particular pockets that are well known.
Well, we've seen that here in Cape Town, not so. I think of the CBD, Century City, Tiger Valley, probably
Yes.
the big three that are the players in this space currently.
And what we found was, when we went with this eCamp thing and we put it on a public site and we made it available to potential investors, they were actually, it blew their mind that they could now get information, high quality, locational information about business nodes which up to then were considered off the map. Kirby Dragons, whether it's Philippi East or Airport Industrial or Somerset West. But so by providing that information, you're opening up the whole board, so to speak. And I thought that was very powerful. And so I think, based on the feedback I've received, this intervention that the city did at very little cost actually had a significant return on investment.
Well, I think that's where I say the magic starts to happen, when you start to get that reaction. So so now in the private sector, Klaus, you're having to rethink about some of your skills, the challenges, and the approaches that you can take in terms of serving your clients in a particular way. How are you thinking about upskilling and using technology, and the whole question of, we're 5 years on from eCamp, for example. Where is it taking you?
eCamp was part of a journey for me in terms of realizing and kind of finding out the hard way, and I have to give credit where credit is due, the city giving me the space to really bump my head on every branch on the way down, so to speak.
How'd you get on?
In terms of just the amount of work that was required to actually being able to access and to collate all the disparate data sets across the city. And that was a monumental task, and Yaku, I'm sure, will also share some insights into what that entails. So eCamp was about, how does one work with data within cities? It was perhaps, if for those of your listeners who might have some understanding of this, it was really an exercise in descriptive statistics rather than predictive statistics. So there wasn't really a model in a sort of a formal sense underlying the eCamp thing. It was really just about business intelligence on a comparative basis.
Although it did look at potential, if I can remember correctly. Yeah?
Yes, it made some inferences, but I wouldn't say that I don't think it's ready for a kind of advanced mathematical journal, so to speak. Where we've moved to subsequently is very, very exciting stuff. I have had the good fortune in working with the World Bank in building urban simulation models. So to start getting an idea of what modeling entails when we start talking about predictive modeling. And the power of models are just incredible. And I think that even though I might sound as if I'm sort of slavishly attached to the notion of smart cities and sophisticated models, I'm actually much more humble and practical in my view towards these things. I don't think they provide an answer, but what these models do is they force us to test our own assumptions. And that's really the power of models, in my opinion. It not only forces you to collate information and to put that together, but we don't realize always, whether we're planners or engineers, the extent to which we rely on certain stylized facts from university or elsewhere without actually empirically testing it and seeing whether these stylized facts, often emanating from context different to ours, whether they can actually be readily applied, or whether we actually need to test our thinking a little bit. So that is, you're asking me about the private sector. This is the space that we're going into, and it's extremely exciting.
Well, we wish you all the best with it, and maybe if we asked you to look back in just one more time, if you could go back and do it all again, the whole learning approach, Would you, in hindsight, have done anything differently? I mean, I'm thinking of your time in Berlin. I'm thinking of your studies here in South Africa. What would you have done different, if anything?
What I would perhaps have done differently is I would have paid more attention at school, actually, especially standard 7, where I started hanging out with the bad crowd instead of learning what a trinomial is. So that would be...
I'll be checking out Google later what a trinomial is. I was hanging with the good guys.
Yeah. So I think that was something I would have, but I think in terms more broadly, what's important is to not lose sight of the fact that you, whomever we are representing a particular set of views. I know that it gets a lot of people's backs up, and perhaps rightfully so, that when somebody comes into the room and declares that all our problems and all our challenges can be resolved through numbers, I don't think that is the case.
Agreed.
I think that there is unfortunately, there's not enough of evidence-based planning and evidence-based policy making isn't fully embedded in South Africa. And I think that it's not just a question of competence and capacity. I think there are political reasons for that. I think that we all agreed on certain nebulous terms of 25 years ago, and now we've got to do the hard yards of actually disentangling those terms, turning it into practical action. And I think that's where our priorities are. For myself, I think I've been driven by curiosity over all these years, and I thank my father for imbuing me with that thirst for knowledge and for learning. For myself, I think I wouldn't say I would take anything back, but you can come with the most convincing argument in your mind, but if you don't learn to listen to other people, and when you don't understand that the world isn't led by fancy arguments, it's led at the end of the day partially by sentiment and interpersonal connection. And so I think that is something that I would like to work on myself. I think that is for any aspirant professional. By the time you hit your mid-30s, you need to start focusing on the subtle nuances of how you engage others around you, because numbers aren't in everything.
On that note, Klaus, a final word for those young, for the aspirant. You're talking about the 30-somethings now. Some of us have passed that a long time ago. But for those who are starting out early in their career, who possibly listen to this podcast and trying to get a sense of opportunity, and some of the journey you've been on would seem like a miracle journey. Any word message of encouragement to that next generation of either activists or professionals who are out there trying to make a difference in their own space?
I would say that I absolutely love my job. I love my profession. One is dealing with something which is infinitely complex. That's the city, that is society. So you will never ever get the better of it. It will always get the better of you. And there's something beautiful about that. For those aspirant planners and professionals, you're going to inevitably working in organizations at some point in your trajectory. And I would just encourage you to break the rules. We are planners, we are generalists. We have to find the common thread and the common purpose between specialists and optimizers around us. So we need to make our voices heard, and we mustn't be cowed by bureaucracy.
On that note, Klaus, thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon. All the very best with all your ventures, and hopefully we get a chance to come back and have a chat in a year or so's time, find out how things are going your way. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Next up, we speak to Jaco Petzer, part 2 of our Talking Transformation podcast, dealing specifically today with the whole question of upskilling in the built environment profession. Here's Jaco Petzer.
So it's a Wednesday afternoon. We're back in the CBD of Cape Town, and I'm here this afternoon with Jaco Petzer. Jaco, thank you very much for spending the time this afternoon with us to reflect a bit on your career to date and some of the approaches that you've used in your career. You, in my mind, have a unique and a fascinating tale to tell about your professional journey, from young private entrepreneur planner in the Free State to one of the most respected planners in the country, with a very much, I would believe, a specialism in the GIS and spatial data world. So welcome, and thank you for allowing me to talk to you about that journey.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you for being here.
Jaco, when did the penny drop for you that an evidence base and using the data to tell a story and convince decision makers was the way to go?
I think for me it started early when, as a consultant, you had to submit applications to the local government and to the authorities, and you always would get questions about, why here, did you provide sufficiently in terms of social facilities, can you see the development from the road, those kind of things. And I realized that it's a good thing to include those answers beforehand, and to have that evidence as a backup. So we started to do things like capture geotechnical surveys, doing visual impact assessments, and I think it's also for a benefit for the people who have to make those decisions. It helps you in just making a informed decision.
When, in that early days of your career, working up in the Free State, did the penny drop for you that an evidence base and using data to convince decision makers was the way to go? I mean, I don't really understand how the Free State was in those early days for you, and what sort of environment was a positive, investment friendly, or whether it was quite a tough environment to try and get decisions from the decision makers. Maybe you want to just reflect a bit on what you recall from that and how you went about your business on the back of that.
I think it was at some point it was difficult to get decision makers to look at applications in an unbiased way. We're not excluding personal feelings about things, and it was useful to be able to provide backing, especially in terms of images, data that you gathered in the field. So things like, for example, at some point we had to do a new policy for leisure residential developments, which is sectional titles in farm, rural areas. So
this is sort of quite a little luxury estate type of development?
It was a luxury estate type of development. And we were looking at coming up with policy guidelines around the sizes that would be permitted. And just from that basis, for instance, having a GIS system where you were able to calculate average sizes of farmers in the Free State.
All of the farmers in the Free State? All
of the farmers in the Free State. I mean, that's the beauty of GIS, the fact that you can do calculations at scale. So that provided a good approach and convincing evidence around what kind of ranges we were talking about. Also, in terms of other applications, when you submit things, questions were raised around do we really need more retail in this area?
Okay, the old retail studies and impact studies, yeah.
And things like maybe not agree 100% with the floor area ratio that you provide, that you applying for. So in terms of that, it's useful to be able to back that with facts and information gathered from surrounding properties. GIS affords you the opportunity to collect information at scale and to reflect back on that information and to use it for other purposes, other projects. So we started to when our structural engineers and the geotech guys went out to the field, you would record that information. So record the depth at which you hit rock and so on, the location of those geotechs, even things like heritage impact assessments, where we would have a specialist going into the field and we would record those the findings. So you start having a database.
I was going to say, you start to create your own database, and that obviously starts to have its own inherent value, I guess, to your clients, and to be able to say you're not necessarily going to do it all over again.
Yeah. No, I think in looking back, I think the ability of adding GIS and these databases in the back benefits. I think the planning profession, it benefits the client, and it's in public interest at large.
I mean, that's fantastic. It's really interesting to hear your reflection on that, and the ability to start layering information and building an argument between different disciplines as well. You mentioned the geotechs, the heritage, the planning, the cadastral base. I think that's where the magic would start to happen. Was there a eureka moment for you in those early days? And that moment where it's like, oh, I get it now. I really this is no longer just a value add to the client, but it's going to become a part of my career, my being as a professional.
I think it was more a sort of a journey, where you start using this information. I think it actually went back a bit further when I started my studies. Those were sort of early days when I still had to go to the library, and the only search facility there was the library search facility is on catalogs, and there I read about decision support systems, and I was quite fascinated by that. But it sounded very theoretical, and things like like academics would use a lot. And then when I started my town planning degree, we were introduced to GIS, first in geography and then in planning. And I knew that in planning I would be using these tools. I would be using computers. GIS would become an essential part of it. And so through the professional development and the expansion of your skills and looking at shortcomings, things that you need to know in order to do your work better. I think it was a journey. The very first thing that I used, I can't even remember the names. It was just a viewer. I think it was just for aerial photographs. Okay. I mean, way back, just the ability of being able to look at aerial photographs as a backdrop to cadastral information was something extremely valuable. So that's where it started, and I recall a product called Small World. I think ArcGIS was version 3.2 or something.
We're now 10 point something or 11.
Yeah, 10.6. So lots of Access, Excel, those kind of software.
6-7 years ago, you make the long journey south. You come down to Cape Town. Your thoughts, your expectations, your hopes and fears about moving from the rural Free State into the urban Cape Town, very much the regional focus for the province, has its own rural areas. But what were your expectations coming down from the Free State into the Western Cape and Cape Town?
I didn't really have any expectations. I was sort of waiting to see what happens here. I think I was excited. I was preparing myself for the next step in my professional career. The job I just secured it felt like it was precisely written for me in terms of the job specifications. It gave me the ability to bring to bear everything I've learned over the couple of years I've been working. I mean, if you look in terms of my job description, it involved spatial analysis, information management, mapping, research,
Do you want to tell us a bit about some of those projects that have been keeping you busy? The projects, the programs, or the initiatives that have kept you busy since your arrival here in 2013?
So some of the projects I've been working on are things like identification of undeveloped and partially developed land. We were looking at identifying transit accessible precincts, densification priority areas, the spatial alignment of the capital budget, looking at infrastructure capacities and risk areas. And then I think to me the biggest one of all was the land use modeling exercise. That kicked off just after I started here, where that was in 2012. It was sort of on the back of a integrated public transport network study that the city was commissioning, and they needed a land use base and a land use future.
Right.
various possible futures.
So understanding the city as it was and what it was predicted to become through a series of variables and assumptions, right?
Yes, exactly that. So it's a number of assumptions, visualizing what the future could be like in 20 years time, and then planning the public transportation to allow for various options going forward. And that information was also then used in other parts of the city for other purposes as well. So for other infrastructure planning. Yes. So I think those were the most important projects I've been working on.
Just picking up again on that land use model. Typically, you're taking, I'm guessing, the sort of cadastral base of the city, which is 1 million or so cadastral units, and then starting to layer that with a whole series of assumptions around population, income groups, land use, zoning, valuation. Are we getting into the realms there of big data and how to start doing millions of calculations? How does that sort of work itself out?
Yeah, I think that was my introduction to big data, and also understanding all those relationships between the data. The cadastral layer obviously forms the basis of everything, and then attached to that you have your land use, you have your zoning, buildings, valuations, and each of those data sets are linked to the cadastral unit. Then we link people to buildings, and along the way there are a number of assumptions, and then the whole object of the study was looking at movement patterns, and then you start realizing the relationship between land use and transportation. The way that land use, the mix of land use, and the intensities of land use pull people into various areas, and with the idea of then trying to see how I can optimize some of those elements, in terms of shortening travel times. So it's something that goes both ways. What can you do on the land use side, and how does transportation respond to that?
Typically, what are the densities that we're looking at to try and support the transportation system? Where are those areas that are most ripe for development? Where is it happening already? How does the formal play? How does the informal play in that space? Those are the sort of aspects that you're looking at, correct?
Yes. So in terms of a land use response to transportation, you would want high intensity mixed use development around areas that are accessible to public transportation. It's a spatial targeting exercise, trying to find those opportunities, and then trying to make it easy to develop in those areas and track development.
When I come into the office in the morning, I've typically got a PowerPoint, I've got Word open, and there's reports or power presentations that have been made, and typically taking data that you've worked on and trying to put that into a way that we can represent and present it to the private sector, the public sector, the politicians, etc. Your screen never looks like mine. Why is that?
Pete, I think firstly it's because I have a dark theme.
Oh, it's just the theme.
That's the one thing. But I regularly use GIS. So there's always at least one GIS application open. And then on the other screen, I probably have like an integrated development environment for Python programming. So during the course of the day, there is something that you do script, especially since most of the GIS packages these days, you can use Python, the programming language there. It makes things easier. You have the ability of automating elements of your work.
By automating, so you can save time.
Yeah, you say if you find that you do the same thing more than twice, there must be a way of scripting that so it becomes easier and automated.
And I guess it also helps in replicating, not so whether you take a time series of this is the moment now in a year's time and 2 years' time.
Yes, I think it becomes important in things like monitoring and evaluation. Where you need to have reproducible results, use the same data, the same methodology. So coding that, and adding the necessary comments just helps you in consistently reporting the same kind of information.
Fantastic. I think your work has taken you into some quite interesting collaborations, not just with built environment professionals like the transportation planners or the engineers that you've already talked about, but I think you're also involved with some of the applied mathematicians. Can you maybe just pick up on some of the interesting collaborations you've had in going down this avenue?
Yeah. Yes, I think the first time we worked with mathematicians was when we tried to do a classification exercise. We were looking at station typologies, and there are various ways of doing that, and it was quite new. The data science profession was quite new. They specialized in that, and they were able to, we provided them with information and domain knowledge, and they were able to show us how classification works and how one would, from a data science perspective, look at planning data that you normally do not. And I think on the back of that, we had further collaborations with them in terms of some very scary algorithms. The last one was a generative adversarial networks.
Oh, one of those. Yes, I've come across those often. Yes.
So, but I think as a planner, one shouldn't be scared of those things. Rather see what those things can do for you. The merging of planning with spatial analysis with GIS, and then the data science component. It forces you as a planner to think differently about things. And if you can apply it to your planning and your everyday work, I think it just enables you to make better decisions and to approach problems from different perspectives. So where I was always told that planning is a very much a grey space that separates the grey a bit, and there are black and white elements, things that you can measure.
Talking of black and white, I think one of my recollections of the good people of the Applied Institute for Mathematical Science was one moment they were looking at classifying black holes, the next moment we asked them to classify my city stations. It was an interesting change in scale and abstract thinking.
Yes.
Jaco, can you imagine a working world in your career, again in your space where you work, where you didn't have this tech available? I mean, you've studied in a traditional way, traditional university, a traditional planning profession. What if all of this that you come in, your grey screen, your grey theme with your Python script running, what if all that wasn't there? How do you think your career would have panned out? Would it have kept you interested? I'd like to understand your thought process on it.
I don't know. That's a difficult question. I cannot imagine a day without all those tech tools. And I mean, if you come into the office, everybody is sitting behind a computer, doing some sort of word processing or other analysis of data. So no, I cannot imagine something else. I think it's also something that kept me interested in the planning profession. I think planning is a to some extent a more generalist profession. I was always told that planners are the blue collar workers of the white collar workers. So I think one being able to bring in other domain knowledge, being able to work transversely, and having all those tools at your disposal, being able to do spatial analysis, just sort of set you apart. I cannot imagine a day without it.
So an abacus and a basic planning theory book is not going to be enough to keep you going. Okay. Jaco, what advice do you have? I mean, you've touched on the don't be afraid of some of the naming conventions and the jargon that is out there. Any other sort of advice to either young or older professionals or people who are working in advocacy groups who are starting out in this idea of either GIS, spatial data, coding, all these fancy words, but ultimately trying to build an evidence base and build a knowledge base? Any words of advice for people starting out?
I think as a planner, if you're a planner working in the built environment, I cannot imagine not being able to use GIS, at least as a tool. And I'm not just talking about mapping, visually displaying information. I'm also talking about being able to do some analysis, spatial analysis. Things like clustering, where do you find certain things in space? How do they cluster? Interpolation. There are certain things I think that as a built environment professional one should be able to do, and GIS just extends your ability to do all of that, and I think it also complements planning very well. We do think in terms of space, and that's the perfect tool to have. So I would definitely say upskill in GIS. That's definitely worthwhile. And then if you're interested and so inclined, add a programming language to that. I'm using Python because it's compatible with GIS. It's fairly easy to learn. It also, I used a home automation system as well, so it's something that you use every day, and it does give you the ability to do things you otherwise would struggle with. Excel can only do so much, especially if you start working with more information, and if there's that iterative process of you have to do something and take decisions along the way. It's ideal to have a tool like that at your disposal.
Jaco, you certainly embody that new wave of professional thinking and the idea of reskilling and rethinking about things. Can I just get a sense of how you went about in those early days? Was it something that you went on courses? Was it something that you were self-taught? Is it a YouTube world? Or how did you go about learning some of the basics?
As far as the GIS is concerned, when that goes back a long way. When I was still studying, I had the opportunity to go on a GIS course with understanding that I sort of had an agreement with the professors there that if I go on this course and bring back some of the knowledge and teach it to fellow students, you may have a student job there.
always an attractive proposition, right?
So that's where there was definitely some formal courses involved as far as the GIS is concerned, and then I think one can really access a lot of information on Google, just doing searches. I think it's useful if you have a project or something that you work on, and you search to find answers, specific things. As far as maybe the scripting and the coding is concerned, there are some basic things that you can teach yourself. But I think it's good to have a question or a project that you're working on, and you want specific answers, and you want to know how to do something. Just go on Google, ask the right questions, and certainly that's one of the ways that I taught myself.
Thanks for sharing that, Jaco. I think that's very useful, and that recognition that it's not only the informal way of teaching yourself is a way of going about it. As you say, it probably does help if you're getting paid to do it at the beginning, however, through varsity. I think a lot of the projects that you've worked on in the city of Cape Town will serve as legacy projects for many years to come, and what you've done, what you've achieved here in a relatively short period of time is remarkable. And I thank you for the contribution you've made to the city and the intelligence within the city, and that the citizens get a benefit from. If it all ended tomorrow, for whatever reason, what would be the proudest achievement in hindsight?
I think I'm proud and fortunate to be able to work in this environment, to have been able to do the kind of work I've been doing, to have met the people I've met. I think when I started here, the quality of the people and the experience was quite intimidating, coming from the Free State. So for a while, my personal motto was up your game, and I think that served one well. Pushing yourself to limits. I think looking back, probably the thing I was most prepared for in terms of my skills and my experience, and also the thing I was most passionate about and enjoyed the most, was the land use modelling work. It's still ongoing, and it's something that you understand, you get, and you feel you're making a contribution in terms of understanding land use patterns. I think from a sort of a city perspective, the land use is something that really forms the basis of most of the work that we do. That's where you raise taxes. That is where people reside. Where the buildings sit for valuations. So I always think that if you understand buildings and land parcels, say land parcel, land buildings, and land use and people, so where are the buildings? Where should they be? Where are the people? Where's the money? I think you can do a lot with that information. That I see as the base information that planning is built on.
Jaco, I can't thank you enough for spending some time dragging yourself away from the Python scripting. I wish you all the very best in the future, and hopefully we can touch base again in a year or so, see how things are going, and see what new miracles you're working on the PC there. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
The third conversation we're having today on the Talking Transformation podcast is with Eloise Rousseau. Eloise is currently based in Hong Kong. So she'll talk first up about her experience there in Hong Kong, having lived there for a year. And then we'll talk a bit more about the boot camp, the coding boot camp that she's been doing this last 4 months or so. Enjoy the third part of this Talking Transformation podcast.
So it's a cold afternoon here in Cape Town, and it's about 2 o'clock. Thousands of kilometres away to the east, I've got Eloise Rousseau on the line in Hong Kong. Eloise, how are you keeping? Are you well?
I'm very well, thanks. It's about 8 o'clock in the evening here. Unfortunately, not as cool as it is in Cape Town. It's quite humid today, but very, very happy to be on the podcast.
Well, really appreciate you taking time out from your weekend to come and have a chat with us. And I think really what we had wanted to investigate and talk to you about was some of your insights on, firstly, Hong Kong. How has that been in terms of a change in lifestyle and a change in place? And secondly, this adventure that you've recently navigated. And, given that today we're talking all about the whole question of coding and how we can utilize data, spatial data and so forth to inform decision making, You've just recently been through a coding boot camp. So those are the two things, Hong Kong and the coding boot camp we'd like to chat to you about.
Sure. So maybe let's start with Hong Kong. I've been in Hong Kong for just about over a year, and I think the biggest adjustment is probably just coming to terms with the density in the city. It's an absolutely vertical city. One of the tallest buildings in Hong Kong is a 118-story building, the International Commerce Center. And the building I currently reside in is one of 4 residential towers. Each tower has got about 37 stories that sit on top of a podium. And as I'm speaking to you, I'm currently in my apartment on the 31st floor, which means I'm about at the same height as the tallest building in Cape Town, which is Portside. And I think Portside clocks in at about 32 stories. And when I first arrived, while I was hunting for an apartment, I saw many adverts describing developments comprising a couple of towers of about 11 stories each as low-rise. So one of the first things I had to do was this complete recalibration of my definition of density. So that's been quite a big adjustment. But one of the amazing benefits of the density is the mass transit railway in Hong Kong. The MTR is really a fantastic and very affordable transport system. And I can't really think of any amenity that is not within walking distance from where I live. So in terms of convenience, it's really an amazing place. But the convenience comes at a price because your space is also very limited and the rental prices are extremely high.
I mean, here in South Africa, I guess we typically talk about between 20 and 30% of household income would go towards accommodation. Is it a similar thing there, or is it quite a different approach?
No, it's definitely a much higher proportion. I think it's one of the most expensive cities, well, not the most expensive, one of the top 10 most expensive cities to live in. And typically people spend a big proportion of their income on accommodation. And if you meet young people in Hong Kong, it's actually quite common to still live with their parents until they get married, because it's just so unaffordable to pay for rent for an apartment on a single salary.
Now, I can imagine it must be quite a big deal, and say in terms of the whole sort of lifestyle and expectations, and as young professionals, that idea, it must be quite challenging.
Yes, it's definitely a completely different context to Cape Town, and it's interesting how the amount of private space has all these strange little impacts that you won't necessarily anticipate. So, for instance, one of the impacts that I didn't see coming is the impact of living in such a small apartment on my social life. So a big part of my social life in Cape Town related to hosting dinner parties, attending dinner parties, and I guess it's a very South African idea of hospitality, kind of opening up your home.
Sure.
And that's quite difficult to do when you live in a really small space. So a lot of your social life gets played out in the city, not in a private space, but in public spaces.
So I mean, typically, what does a Friday, Saturday evening look like in downtown Hong Kong?
You're not in your apartment and you're not at someone else's apartment. Yeah, it's quite common here to eat out. So I think in South Africa, when you go out to dinner, it's typically a special occasion where here people dine out as a functional means of eating. So the restaurant scene is absolutely amazing and very diverse. But yes, people don't spend a lot of time at home.
Well, thanks for sharing some of those insights, Eloise. You've been there just over a year now, is that correct?
Yes, correct.
So, Eloise, when you look back at some of your contributions that you made here in Cape Town, which are some of the aspects that you reflect on most fondly? And perhaps in the same reflection, what were the learning challenges that came your way, the skills that you had to learn and develop during the time you were working?
So I spent about 8 years working in Cape Town with the City of Cape Town in 3 different departments. I started out in land use management, and then I moved to the spatial planning side of things, first working in district spatial planning at the district scale, and then later on joining the metropolitan spatial planning team. And I think when you work in Cape Town, you've got a very strange professional context of one part of the city is really very developed and almost like a first world environment. And when you get to work in other parts of the city, it almost feels like a completely different context and a different set of rules applying. And a lot of the challenges I found early on in my career is almost managing the ethical conflict for me, whether the same set of rules that apply to wealthy areas should also apply to poorer areas, whether the legislation that's been written with formal areas in mind should also be applied equally enthusiastically in informal areas. And it's a question that I haven't completely resolved, because I think there's something to be said for keeping Cape Town and all its citizens to the same standard, and for them as citizens to have similar expectations about service delivery. But often the problems seemed very obvious, but the solutions were not. And I often find myself quite frustrated being told, oh, we can't do certain things. So I think some of the most exciting work I was involved in the city of Cape Town was usually around challenging the conventional way of doing things. And I think a lot of people see legislation and policies as this rule book or this static thing where the answer is either yes, you can do it, or no, you can't do it, where I think that view of legislation is problematic, especially when the legislation and the policies are preventing you from addressing challenges that we all know we can't just leave them in perpetuity. They won't solve themselves.
Sure. And achieving some of those outcomes and so forth that legislation and redress demands, not so?
Yes, I think it's important as planners to also take responsibility in cases where policy and legislation is either not reflecting the current position or it's clearly not capable of addressing the challenges, to then lobby for those things to change, because it's really a reflection of the time in which they were written. So, yeah, I think that was probably some of the most exciting work I did, and the work I think of very fondly.
And in terms of the skills that you had to start thinking about, in terms of, you get taught at tertiary education a particular groove or rhythm around approaches, and then in the practical world you need to start thinking on your feet over and above the theory. How did you come to terms with some of those challenges and some of the skill sets that you started thinking, hold on a minute, maybe there are another way to look at this?
I think one of the challenges starting your career as a very young planner in the public sector is you're immediately thrown into the deep end and you find yourself in very contentious situations. So, for instance, when I started working in land use, you were immediately in this environment of, having to manage policy compliance with the aspirations of developers, with the aspirations of politicians. And I think being able to state your case clearly and convincingly was quite a challenge, especially when it wasn't backed with any kind of empirical evidence. So as I progressed in the city of Cape Town and as my paths crossed with people like Klaus and Jaco, who had developed these very exciting data-driven tools, I also realized that often it is very difficult to sell a certain approach when you don't have the facts to back it up. And I think in planning, even though we should be driven by facts, we are sometimes a little bit guilty of almost too much of our personality coming through in our ideas, or maybe taking some creative liberties. I can think of examples where, people would criticize the way in which the urban edge was delineated, saying, well, it's just an arbitrary line in this area. There's no specific logic behind it. And I think when you're the person having to defend policy positions like that, it really is challenging when there's not clear reasoning behind it.
So, Eloise, your first tertiary qualification was in chemistry, and then you flipped the page to become an urban planner, quite a 180-degree turn in terms of career aspirations. And even with that science background, when we first met, you never really struck me as the person who enjoyed the coding and the GIS. That was definitely not your thing. Yet here you are, looking at a new learning and reskilling path. And congratulations on finishing and graduating from the course. Love to hear more about that and the road that you took in approaching that.
Sure. Thank you very much, Pete. I think I've got quite an interesting academic background or journey. It took me a while to find my niche, and planning was definitely a passion of mine that I discovered a little bit later in life. But as you say, I've never been particularly interested in GIS or in technology for that matter. I was very much drawn to the policy side of planning, so developing policy, being involved in spatial development plans, and part of the process of developing a spatial plan, that is an important component of it. So I think my background gave me some comfort with numerical analysis, but I've never been particularly interested in technology. I'm the last person to upgrade their cell phone. It's, as you say, it's just not my thing. Working with Klaus and working with Jaco and seeing the kind of tools that they were developing and the way in which it empowered you as a planner to make your case, I just felt that I'd reached a level where, with my knowledge of Excel, I'd kind of reached a threshold of not being able to really engage with it as intensely as I would like to. And also just many of these tools were developed in Excel when really the data sets that were driving these tools were so enormous that I felt I spent so much energy, just changing tabs, these trillions of tabs in Excel, just trying to find your way. And I was very inspired by Jaco, who's a self-taught coder, but also a brilliant planner. And the way in which he was able to combine coding with GIS, I felt really took the work of the metropolitan planning branch to the next level. And I didn't want to miss out on that. And I started realizing that if you're a planner working in the public sector, and especially if you're working at a citywide scale with these big data sets, Excel was only going to get you so far. So when I relocated to Hong Kong, I had the opportunity to reskill or upskill myself. And for me, it was a choice between learning Cantonese or Mandarin or learning to code. And I thought learning to code was the easier option. And it seemed like a good investment in a skill. The same way if you and I look at job adverts today, no job advert is going to ask you for proficiency in Microsoft Word and PowerPoint and Excel. It's just assumed that that's part of your skill set. And from a lot of my, a lot of my reading indicated that there are a lot of thought leaders that are saying that coding is going to be one of those skills where it's not even seen as an inherent skill in a decade's time. It will be like being able to use Excel. It's just a tool that you will need. So I think for me, the writing was on the wall, just seeing the scale of the data sets being worked with, and at the same time, seeing how immensely empowering it is when you can leverage data to make your point for certain policy positions.
I think just to pick up on your point, if I'm not mistaken, the state president in his recent State of the Nation address had talked about, introducing coding into schools at quite an early age, of trying to get the national curricula to look at these things. So I think you're absolutely right that what was the norm, maybe what the norm is now, 10 years ago was something different. As you say, Microsoft Office you're either good at or semi-skilled at PowerPoint or Excel. Now those are just the givens, and with that world, that expectation has changed. I think you're absolutely right. Who else did you find on the course? Who else was there with you?
It was a very interesting mix of both local students as well as expats, such as myself. The majority of the students had some kind of background, so they had either taken a coding course at university. We had one student with a computer science background. Likewise, we also had someone with an economics background, but then also a lot of really young students, just excited to learn about coding and not yet established professionals, still on their journey of skilling up to prepare themselves for the workforce. And not in my cohort, but another cohort, I also met a lady who told me that she wants to learn to code because she's got 2 young children and they are going to learn coding in school, and she wants to make sure that she can help them. So
family experience.
That was a very interesting approach or reason for coding. And even in my building, I'll often see posters advertising coding camps for children as young as 3 years. So there's definitely a sense in Hong Kong that, you know, coding is an important skill to have in the market.
Well, what really impressed me was the blog that you published. It was about a week ago. I think you did it through the LinkedIn platform. And the blog talked about that experience and specifically highlighted 4 very practical things that you learned. Can you maybe just reflect on those 4 things quickly?
Sure. So I had the opportunity to write a blog for the school through which I did the bootcamp called Accelerate. They're an education startup based in Hong Kong. And my experience was quite intense. It's a very intensive 4-month curriculum, and coming into it with no prior background in coding, I just wanted to take some time to reflect on my experience and also share that with anyone that's maybe considering learning to code but not sure if they're up for it or unsure about what to expect. And I think the biggest mind shift for me was understanding that a bootcamp environment is fundamentally different from studying at university. So first of all, there's a big difference in the tempo of learning. The entire concept of a bootcamp is for it to be quite intense and immersive. So you spend a lot of time just coding in a very short period. So during our first week of coding, some of my classmates said this is what the material they would typically cover in a semester. So it can be quite overwhelming, the workload. But whereas my education from a tertiary background was very much around understanding the concept behind things before practically applying the knowledge, the bootcamp almost had a reverse environment where you were encouraged to experiment very early on, and then through your experimentation, when you encountered challenges, you would need to read to try and find a way of solving those challenges. And I was very skeptical of this approach in the beginning because, you know, as a planner, we're kind of taught about the risk of intervening in situations where you don't understand the context. So I can think of a million examples of a bad idea of intervening in the built environment where things really didn't go according to plan because you didn't understand enough beforehand. So I guess I have quite a cautious approach to being practical, and as planners, some of us, you know, we never get more practical than writing the policy document. I was quite hesitant with this learning philosophy. And in the blog, I write about how all my classmates were coding and I was sitting there reading my academic papers, trying to understand the details of the algorithms. And I got to a point where I just felt completely overwhelmed by the theory, and where I realized that there's a fundamental difference between people developing these algorithms, which are generally people with PhDs in mathematics or statistics, and people using the algorithms. And there was no expectation for me to understand absolutely everything about the mathematics behind the algorithm. I just need to be able to use it in a responsible way. So definitely my learning took a turn for the better once I stopped reading so much and actually just try working with these tools. And yeah, I think that's definitely an approach that I would encourage other people, especially coming from a very theoretical background. Even if it feels counterintuitive, just force yourself to experiment as much as you can and gain practical experience, and not to get lost in the theory, because it can be quite overwhelming, but there is no expectation of you to have a full theoretical understanding before being allowed to use these technologies.
I mean, what a fantastic lesson, sort of life lesson almost, of again, changing the approach fundamentally, changing what you've been comfortable with in all of your studies that have gone beforehand, and really challenging that convention and saying there is another way, and don't be afraid of it.
Yes, I actually found this environment to be really quite open. I guess there's always been something elitist about tertiary education, and I made the comment that sometimes I felt like a little medical intern on my first day of studying medicine, and this world famous brain surgeon is handing me, you know, a newly developed scalpel saying, do you want to have a go at that patient's brain? Like, just give it a try. And I kept feeling like this is irresponsible. People can die. I should study for another 6 years, and only then I'm allowed to touch the scalpel. And the wonderful thing about this industry is a lot of the technologies and a lot of the algorithms, they're so accessible. So the barriers to entry of using these amazing technological inventions are actually surprisingly low. And when you learn to code in Python, one of the benefits of Python is that there are so many libraries that you can use in Python that makes it really easy to use these super sophisticated tools. So that was a big mindset change I had to make. And it's also actually quite wonderful to think that no matter where you are in the world, if you've got an internet connection and if you're willing to put in the time, you can learn to code and you can use these very elaborate and impressive algorithms without ever going to university.
And just to be clear here, when you talk about the libraries, we're talking about online libraries of Python code, right?
Yes, so library is typically something you would install, and then it just enables the use of the algorithm in Python much easier.
What is coding? What is that as a principle? For somebody who's listening to this for the first time and saying, yeah, I keep hearing about this coding thing, but I have no idea what it is. How would you go about describing it in its most simplest of terms?
Coding is a language, so similar to the English language, which has got syntax and grammar. It's a computer programming language, and there are many languages out there. And different people have different preferences, but Python is one of the most common coding languages, and it's also considered one of the easiest coding languages to learn. So any person interested in data science would generally be encouraged to learn to code in Python. So it's a computer programming language. And
typically the Python is also quite compatible with the sort of GIS world and GIS environment that typically we'd be involved in, not so?
Correct.
For a novice or a skeptic, the listener who is just saying absolutely no way, this is not for me, do you have any message for them maybe? And I guess it's not right for everyone, I would get that, but for those like me, I've just signed up for my own sort of two-month boot camp. For those who are wavering and starting out, what are the words of encouragement that you might have for them?
So I'm a little bit skeptical of saying every planner needs to learn to code. One thing I do feel quite strongly about is that my generation, the days of going to university and obtaining a degree and having a feeling that you're now, from an education and learning perspective, you're set for life, those days are over. So whether it's coding, I'm not sure, but my sense is that it's important not to become complacent about your skill set. And as a mid-career professional that has just been through the process, I can tell you that it's quite humbling. It's like learning a new language from scratch. So often it can be quite discouraging, or you can feel really stupid and ask yourself, well, I'm so established in my career, or I'm so confident in these other professional areas. Why should I struggle like this? And I really think the world is changing in a way where it's impossible to skill and to expect that skill to just remain relevant in perpetuity, or at least until retirement age. I think it's important for everyone that has still got, a good 30 or 40 years of working left to be aware that it's important to have a learning mindset, and the lessons that we've been taught and the skills that we have, it's unlikely going to serve us until retirement. So for me, there's a stick and a carrot approach. So you can either learn to code because you're worried about becoming irrelevant, or you can see it as an opportunity to better yourself and to have access to greater tools that, whether you're a lawyer or a financier or a journalist, I think any professional person will find that there's just more data around them. And the abilities of programs like Excel to deal with that data is limited compared to coding. Yeah, so I'm a little bit hesitant to say, this is the answer, learn to code and
sure,
for life.
Understand. Understood. Yeah.
It's more about realize that you will probably be challenged during your career to learn a new skill. And for you to stay learning fit, it's very important not to become too set in your ways or too much stuck in a comfort zone. So, whether it's coding or not, it's about being open and being flexible and being willing to learn continuously. And I've just finished this boot camp, and in the 4 months that it took me, there are probably a lot of things that I've learned that's now already out of date. That is the tempo of change in this industry.
I think what the other thing that I'm observing from the outside looking in is it takes a lot of courage and commitment to try something different and to recognize the need to adapt. And again, as I say, I'm absolutely thrilled for you. I really am delighted that you've taken this approach, and look forward to seeing how it plays itself out in the years to come or the months to come as you're looking at different options and opportunities there in Hong Kong or further afield.
Thank you very much, Pete.
Where to next for you in terms of your own personal learning adventures, Eloise? Any thoughts about what you'd like to do or what you're looking at right now?
So I've always been a little bit of a tech skeptic. I think I'm quite an old school planner. I find something very romantic about bump paper and, tracing maps. And I'm quite adamant that there's still an element of art to planning and to creating amazing cities. It's not just a number crunching game.
Sure.
So I'm very interested in this interface between technology and city making. And now that I've got a better understanding of some of the technologies that are being used in smart cities proposals, one of my areas of interest is really looking at how do we enable planners to participate in that conversation, especially because a lot of the technological advances are happening so quickly that there's really no time for the policy and the legislation to catch up. So I think that's an area where I hope to get more involved in.
Eloise, well, I really want to thank you for spending some time with us. I think you've really shared a very creative and impressive journey there. Thank you for your time. All the very best with what comes in the future, and enjoy the rest of your time in Hong Kong.
Thank you very much, Pete, and it's a pleasure talking to you.
Get involved, get informed, most importantly, get subscribed. You can find us on our Twitter feed at Talking Transfo and the number 1. That's Talking Transfo 1. Talking Transformations music kindly supplied by Tribal Need. Find them at tribalneed.com.